Well, hello and welcome. My name is Topher Field, and I only have half a voice left for reasons that I'm sure many of you will already be well aware of and will understand. So I'll be sipping on my tea quite a lot tonight to try and keep the vocal cords alive while we go. Wow. What a day. What a day. There is a lot to talk about on the one hand. On the other hand, I'm actually still processing it. It doesn't feel real. If I'm honest, it doesn't feel real. I know it is real. But you know how you go on holidays and you come back from being on holidays and a week later, the holiday feels like it's like this alternate timeline. It just kind of sits outside of the regular timeline. Like I've arrived home and I'm just kind of like, did that happen today? Was that real? Because that's what I've been hoping for, and that's what I've been, I guess, dreaming of since April 25th, 2020. Since that very first rally with 70. Yeah, tonight's going to get messy. So, for those of you that are joining me for your very first slow chat, welcome. This is a bit of a weird affair at the best of times, and tonight is going to be weird even by the usual slow chat standards. This evolved out of a way that I have of decompressing, staying sane, and we've all needed a bit of that in the last 2 years. And one of my favorite ways of staying sane is by enjoying one of God's all-natural, no processed ingredients whatsoever, relaxation sticks. And today I've actually got a Gurkha Beauty. This thing is monstrous, and this was actually a gift. So thank you. You know who you are. This was actually a gift to me. It was part of a care package that was sent to me by someone to give me more cigars to smoke to help me deal with the pressure of the documentary and all of that stuff. So I'm going to be enjoying this tonight. It is a Connecticut, which means it's more of a lighter flavored. The flavor profile is more likely to be sort of sweeter, a bit more straw, often a bit of cream, a bit of baked goods, light spice, cinnamon, these sorts of flavors. And so I'm pairing that with what, for my palate, is a reasonably light scotch as well, the Glenlivet 12. So thank you for the gift. I do appreciate that. So that's what happened. One of the things that happens, or two of the things that happens, there's cigars, there is scotch, and there is talking. And I will be looking at lots of your questions because I don't have a massive amount to say. Like I said at the very beginning, I'm still processing this. I'm still coming to terms with the fact that it's real. That actually just happened. That we actually had somewhere north of 300,000, or let's just say, let's be conservative, we had north of 250,000 people show up in support of freedom in a park in Melbourne today. And if you believe the numbers from Sky News and others, it could be a lot more than 250,000 people. And I had the privilege, the absolute honor of being one of the people that got to stand up in front there and talk to you guys. And you were the best crowd I've ever spoken to. And I've spoken to a few over the years, but you guys, you weren't just a big crowd. You were with me. You were there with me. And it was amazing. It was amazing. So thank you. That was a gift that you guys gave to me that I will never forget. So thank you. I'm going to light this up. I want to debrief a little bit because obviously I did a slow chat the other day talking about what was needed now that Adam Somyurek had kind of come out and done what he did and said what he said, what was needed from us. And the number one thing that was needed was for today to be massive. Guess what? Today was massive. And as a result, we've definitely done all that we can do in one day. There's nothing more that we could have done in any one day to try and achieve change and to keep the pressure on the crossbenchers. So let's talk a little bit about how I think Daniel Andrews is likely to respond and some of the other moving parts that are going to start to come into play now. I have a sneaking suspicion that the Federal Labor Party, with one eye on their election, which is coming up in the first half of next year, most likely, they've got one eye on that, and they're looking at what's happening down here in Victoria, and they're looking at Daniel Andrews, and they're probably starting to think that maybe Daniel Andrews is becoming a bit of a liability to their federal campaign. I think there might be some interesting politics going to unfold in that area there. Now, this thing is an absolute monster. This is one of the biggest cigars I've ever had. And it's taking some lighting. You don't want to light a cigar too fast. You want to light it nice and slow, but you do have to make sure it is thoroughly lit. Okay, so what does today mean? What does it achieve? It means a lot to me personally, and it says a lot about what's been achieved by all the amazing people that have been a part of this movement. Some people have joined more recently. Some people have been going for as long as I have. But it's an incredible achievement from all of those people, from the organizers, from you guys, to show up and to be a part of it. Yeah, wow, this thing is going to take some serious lighting. That should mean that once it's lit, it'll stay lit, but goodness me, I thought I'd lit it, and then I relit it, and now I'm having to hit it again. What does this mean? What this means is that Daniel Andrews cannot continue to get away with his lies about us being a small group of extremists. That is a naked lie now. We have exposed that lie to no one. No reasonable person could look at the images from today and conclude that Daniel Andrews was telling the truth. Yeah, far out. This thing's huge. So that really changes the playing field. I said the other day in a post that I felt that Daniel Andrews was getting desperate, and that this extremist language that he was using, accusing us all of being extremists, etc., it had the air, it had that ring of desperation. Daniel Andrews is a masterful politician. I think he's a horrible human being and very deficient in many ways, but he's a masterful politician, and politics has a lot to do with messaging. There's a lot in common. A couple of funny comments coming through. Simon, Tobacco, good to meet you today, Simon. Thank you for saying hi and sticking around with us. Meg, great to meet you today as well. Chris saying, so proud of Melbourne, thought I would never see this day. Yeah. Biggest problem of the day is lighting a cigar. Good work, Australia. Yes. So I'm having a few scotches today. Question, do cigars work with Islay peat smoky scotch like a Balmoral Legend, or is that too much smoke? Strong cigars do. If I was having like a KO, a Flathead 554 or 660 or something like that, that would go very well with a cigar like that. But it's just all about matching them. Hi from the Hunter Valley. Oops, I've lost you. Comments are scrolling too fast. I've lost. Hey, Craig. Welcome, man. So proud of what has been achieved. No more fear. Absolutely. And Craig made a beautiful comment to me. We were chatting off to the side of the stage before either of us had given our speeches. And I was just trying to process what I was seeing. And I was trying to make sure that when I got out there to do my speech, I didn't get overwhelmed by the moment. And so I said out loud to Craig what was kind of going on in my head. And I just said, man, I went and spoke at the very first rally. There were 70 people there. I copped more abuse in the sort of 72 hours after that than I've had in probably most of the rest of my life combined. I was called all kinds of things, threatened with all kinds of things. I've lost friends, I've lost family, as a lot of us have. I'm certainly not alone in that. I've been intimidated by the police. I've been arrested. Again, I'm not alone in that. I'm not the only one, but it has happened to me. All in the hope that one day today would happen. That one day would be today. And I was just looking at that crowd and I could feel I was going to lose it. And so I was just sort of Craig was there and I tapped him on the shoulder and I was just sort of blurting this stuff out to try and process it. And he said to me, that's what happens from never giving up. That's what I think what he said was, that's what never giving up looks like. And that's exactly it. That's exactly what this is. This is what never giving up looks like. This is not the end of the fight by any stretch of the imagination, but we've turned the tables. The momentum is with us now. The power is in our hands now, and Daniel Andrews is having to react to us now. We've completely turned the tables on him. Thank you, everyone, for your very, very kind feedback on the speech and so forth. It was amazing, and it was an amazing gift from you guys to me, for everyone that was there. I've done some stage acting, I've done some screen acting, but as a stage actor, what you really want is that connection to the audience. And I tell you, today I had a connection to you guys that I've never felt before, and I may very well never feel again. And that's a gift that you guys gave to me that I will never forget. Thank you. So, what does Daniel Andrews do from here? Well, sorry, before that, what did we achieve today? Well, I said a couple of days ago in the last slow chat that I did that what absolutely had to happen was we needed massive numbers, because we needed to put those backbenchers on notice that if they did a deal with Daniel Andrews and if they sold us out, as I said in my speech today, then we would not forget. And good luck to them getting re-elected, having pissed off 10% of Melbourne's population. These backbenchers are usually elected on very small margins, and they can't afford to lose very many voters. So good luck having pissed off all of us. Man, this thing is massive, and I'm having to puff it 4 or 5 times. Okay. So we achieved that. That's what we needed to do. And thanks to you guys showing up, we've done that now. Tick. Big tick. We did it in spectacular style. They tried to organize a counter-protest. A complete fail. In terms of actually affecting what we were doing, a complete fail. I could kind of hear them. I could kind of hear their drums off to one side, but I promise you, they could hear us. And when you guys roared at, whether it was my speech or anyone else's speech, when you guys lit up, they could hear you far more than we could ever hear them. So, Samantha Ratnam sent out her rat bags. Didn't really affect us. After all that we've been through, after all that Daniel Andrews has done to us, all that Victoria Police has done to us, this is how we punch back. We have turned the tables. We have shifted the momentum in our favor now. It's going to be very difficult for Daniel Andrews to get a crossbencher to agree to his bill in anything close to its current form. I think we can rule out any crossbencher flipping without some really, really big revisions. Now, I don't want that to happen, but I'm just saying this is a state of play. I think that what we achieved today was a complete taking off the table any chance that any crossbencher is going to flip, unless they have lots of really big revisions that they can point at and say, see, I did that. I achieved that. See how much less bad it is. See how much better it is. That was because of me. Once there's enough difference between the bill right now and the bill that they agree to, then they can start to message it. They can start to massage the messaging around that and claim some credit for those changes. But any possibility of any crossbencher agreeing to the bill in anything like its current form, I think is off the table. I don't think it's going to happen. It would be political suicide. And I think that they can see that very clearly because of today. So where does that leave us? Well, Daniel Andrews is going to be desperate as I think this through, and I'm just wargaming this in my head. Like I said, I'm still processing stuff. I'm still processing stuff. So Daniel Andrews is going to be desperate to get this legislation through before the 15th of December, which is when the current state of emergency ends and all the powers end. And he needs to do that because if there is a period where he doesn't have any of these powers, there's a risk that we're going to get used to that. There's a risk that we're going to look around and go, hang on, why did he need those powers in the first place? Nothing's gone horribly wrong. So he can't really allow that to happen. So he has to get something through. But like I said, he can't get the current bill through. That's just, I think that's off the table completely. And so that means there's going to be some serious wheeling and dealing going on in those back rooms. And they've got basically a week to put this together. What does that look like? Sorry, I'm genuinely just processing this. I'm genuinely just thinking this through. There are a number of people that we can be very sure are not going to flip. I would include David Limbrick, Tim Quilty. I would include Catherine Cumming, despite a lot of the noise that's been around her recently, people not really understanding why she's done what she's done. I would consider her to be one of the good ones. Adam Somyurek is not going to flip. Have a look at his tweet that he put out today. He's not going to flip. There's probably a few others that can be guaranteed that they're not going to flip. But then you get to a few that might be vulnerable. The Justice Party, Darren Hinch Party, I think there's 2 members of the Legislative Council that belong to that party. If I was Daniel Andrews, that's probably where I'd be starting, somewhere around about there. What does he offer them? What he has to do to get them on board is convince them that they will be heroes elsewhere, even though they might be villains to us, if that makes sense. Convince them, okay, that's the play. That's the play. Interesting. Let me run this past you, see what you think. See whether this makes sense to you. The play for Daniel Andrews now is that he has to make the coronavirus super scary again. Because remember, he's saved us, right? Remember? He saved us. We would have all been dying. All of our grandmothers would be dead if it weren't for him. He's got to get back to that. And he's got to get there either with, amping up a new variant, amping up the dangers of Delta, because that's still the one that's kind of mostly going around. He's got to get to the point where he can turn around to someone like the 2 Darren Hinch Justice Party MPs and say, listen, if these emergency powers end, everyone's going to be terrified. Everyone is afraid of what would happen if these emergency powers are allowed to end. You can be the hero and do the right thing and extend them further and give me the permanent powers that I need to be able to continue. That, I think, from where I'm sitting, is the smart play from Daniel Andrews at the moment. He has to get back to his fear because, unfortunately, it works. It doesn't work on most of us anymore, but it works on an enormous number of people. That's going to be hard to do because they've played most of the fear cards already. The people who are going to be afraid are already afraid. If anything, people are moving in the other direction. They're going from being afraid to being unafraid. And today is going to really help a lot of people on that journey. Jim says he spoke to Stewart on Facebook. He ain't changing his no vote. I spoke to Stewart on Facebook. He ain't changing his no vote regardless of it being watered down. Interesting. That's good to hear. Okay. I'm glad people got that reference, the I'm the captain now reference, or we're the captain now reference. I was a bit worried that people wouldn't get it. Yeah, Veronica, people are moving out of fear and waking up. And this is going to make Dan running, if his next play depends on a fear basis, a foundation of fear, then his foundation is kind of crumbling. So is that the right play? Have I missed something? Is there a better play? Sorry, guys. Normally I've done all this already, and I sit down and I share my thoughts with you over an hour or hour and a half or what have you before I answer some questions. But I literally got home less than an hour before this started and quickly had dinner and said hi to the kids and sat down. So you're watching my process. You're watching me work, basically. Trying to understand the position that we're in, anticipate what our opponents are likely to do, and understand what our smartest play is under those circumstances. So I'm sorry if this is even more scattered than normal by my often very scattered standards. But hey, if you enjoy it and if you enjoy getting an insight into the madness within, then hey, stick around. Is there a non-fear based play? I mean, this whole thing's been a fear play. All the emergency measures, etc., they're all based on fear. Does he have a pivot that isn't based on fear? If fear is losing its steam, and I believe it is, he's not necessarily just going to keep on making the same mistake and overplaying the same dead hand. Where else does he go? There is another angle. The you owe me angle. And this would serve his ego very well. I don't know if it would play well. I saved Victoria from tens of thousands of COVID deaths in 2020 and 2021, and it's only because we've got such high vaccination rates that we're not seeing all these deaths now. And so you owe me. I have given such wonderful leadership all the way through this. And this is what's necessary for me to continue giving this amazing leadership, and you owe me. I can't see that working because for that to be effective in winning over an MP, he has to get that message out into the public. He has to create the perception that that's what the people believe. I don't know. What am I missing? Tell me, is there another play here for him? He's just watched anywhere between, I'm going to say at least 250,000, anywhere between 250,000 and 500,000 people show up in Melbourne calling for him to be sacked, calling for his bill to be killed off. He's losing control of the situation. What's his play now? Bribes? Blackmail? Yeah, so David, this is a good point. This is, oops, it's all moving too fast. There we go. You know, Dan, in his arrogance, has absolutely pissed off the crossbench, with the exception of his three pets. He's absolutely pissed off the crossbench, and this is coming back to bite him now. He is a narcissist, Janine. You're absolutely right. So how does a narcissist, how does someone who cannot conceive of their own failure and really believes their own bullshit, how does he react to this moment besides being angry and shouting and throwing some things? I don't know. I'm going to park that one because I'm not coming up with an answer. Revenge, guilt and shame, playing the victim, going for the kids, the humble card, I was only trying to help. Look, even narcissists are capable of pathological lying, or actually they're especially capable of pathological lying. So yes, you might actually try and play the humble card. Having dirt on anyone that flips on him, maybe. Okay. I'm going to park that for a sec because I don't have, that needs to process for a bit longer. So what do we do? Regardless, we can't, even if I did have a clear answer, there's no guarantee I'm right. We can never know for sure what our opponents are going to do. So regardless of what he does, what do we do? Well, number one, we need to be sharing every piece of content from today online, far and wide, getting it out onto international blogs and media, just sending it everywhere, posting links of it everywhere. And the reason for that's fairly simple. We know how much the mainstream media will lie about us and will try and diminish our numbers and so forth. And we were so big today that they couldn't even really get away with that. They actually had to give some estimates that I think are actually, I think the real number is somewhere within the range of estimates that were given, which is a nice change. It's quite refreshing. So that's a good thing. But they can still lie about the vibe and the tone. They can still isolate a few little incidents that may have happened. I was in the middle of the crowd, so I didn't see what happened at the edge of the crowd. Maybe some things happened at the edge of the crowd. Maybe there's some stuff that's going to hit the news tomorrow about what a bunch of assholes we all were, right? But sharing live streams, showing who the crowd were, sharing the speeches, showing what we were saying. We're not calling for segregation. We're not a bunch of white supremacists. We are specifically preaching love. And there are people of every color and creed in the crowd flying flags from the countries that they have come from all over the globe. And they were all welcome in that crowd. And people who only consume the mainstream media might get fooled. So the first and most important thing that we can be doing is sharing the videos and sharing the photos, especially because due to the crowd being so massive, my live stream went down and a bunch of other people's live streams went down because there just wasn't the capacity in the phone system. The data wasn't available. So that means that, unfortunately, to my knowledge, I actually haven't looked, but I don't know. Can someone tell me, what did Rookshawn have on his live stream today? Because I did see that he did have his live stream working at times. It was pretty jittery. It wasn't stable, but it was working. So yeah, if anyone saw what his numbers were today, I'd love to hear that it was over 100,000, but I really don't know. But because the streams weren't great quality, they were being affected by the low. So Corey says around about 10,000. So quite low by Rookshawn's standards. And that would largely be because 12 to 15, says Jason, up to 18 at one stage. Okay, so certainly not the sort of numbers that he's had in the past. And I don't say that as a criticism, by the way. But what happens when you've got a really low quality feed and it keeps starting and maybe stops a few times and you have to restart the feed, you lose everybody, they have to find you again. It's very, very hard to build the size of the viewer base that he's had at other times. So that makes it even more important for us to share what he did stream. So go find Real Rookshawn, The Real Rookshawn on Instagram, and I think he's just Real Rookshawn on Facebook. Find his stuff, post it, share it around, make sure the world sees it, tag friends of yours that are overseas. All right, and specifically try and create a new node, a new cluster where that person hopefully will share it, and they've got a completely different group of friends on Facebook that are then going to start to be exposed to this stuff all over the world. So this is we've moved from the ground war to the information war, and we'll be back to the ground war again next weekend probably. We'll see how things unfold in the next few days. But we're now in the information war phase, and this is something that you can do even if you can't attend the protests. You can still help in the information war, and this is where we have. So Tammy J apparently had a great live, says Juliet. Thank you. So help to get that out. That's the first thing, first and foremost, because even though they're having a hard time lying about the numbers, they can still try and lie about who we were and why we were there. The second thing I think that you can do, if you were there and you're willing to, write a Facebook post on your own page about the atmosphere, about the people you spoke to, about the speeches you heard, about why you were there. Humanize those people. Now, yes, are you going to get some people, giving you a hard time? Probably. Okay, trust me, I've lived that for 20 months. I understand what that's like. It's not exactly pleasant. And yes, you can lose friends over this. You can end up with family members that won't speak to you over this. All that can happen. But the other thing that can happen is people who are seeing this on the news or maybe coming across a feed or two online, they're afraid, they're confused, they're getting mixed messages, they don't understand. And then someone that they know posts and says, "Hey, I was there and this is what I saw." That that first-hand account can be very, very influential on those people. Like the people who are never going to change their minds, they're never going to change their minds. But on the people that are thinking, a first-hand account can be really, really influential. So if you were there and you'd be willing to, that's another thing that you could do that would really help. Write a first-hand account on your own Facebook page, put it up as a post and say, "Hey, I was there. This is what I saw. This is what I heard. This is what it felt like. This is why these people were there." And that first-hand account then, can influence, just even if it's only a few people, but if enough people do it, then there's a lot of people that has a knock-on effect. And there's a lot of people who are quietly on our side, but they're afraid to speak up, or they're so consumed in the mainstream media bubble, they think they're alone. And they don't think they want to come to a protest because they think we're all a bunch of crazy anti-vaxxy, conspiracy theory, whatever. And hearing someone's first-hand account may give those people the boldness to reach out to you and go, "Hey, tell me more." It is still worth sending emails to MPs, the crossbench especially. So it is still very much worth sending emails to them. Make them polite, keep them fairly short, but personal. Tell a tiny bit, tell your story tell the one paragraph version of your story and how you've been affected and why you're joining the protests and why you're asking them not to extend any further pandemic powers. And ask them not to pass this bill in any form. Tell them that you don't believe these powers need to be extended. And if somehow something happens next year where they are necessary again, well, then we can have that conversation at that point in time, but there is no need for them to be extended right now. Make that argument, right? Make it concise, make it polite, and just keep that pressure on. Just keep sending those in the coming days and the coming weeks. Make sure that they understand that this is not an issue that we're paying attention to on weekends. Or, we're going to show up at a rally and then go, "Oh, that was fun," and we all go home and forget about it. Make sure that they understand we are continuing to watch. I think the other big thing that we can be doing is continuing to network with each other, continuing to build community with each other. I'm incredibly grateful to all of you. You are, in a very important sense, a part of my community now. You help me by listening to me as I debrief, as I process, as I think things through, by sending me messages, by sending me tips. Probably, 25% of the posts that I put up have come through as a tip from someone that sends me something and I go, "Ooh, I didn't know about that," or "That's an update to something that I posted about before. I'll post that as well." So you guys have become a very important part of what I do. And yes, what I do is very public. But the same dynamic is at play in much smaller, much more private types of communities where you can be supporting each other, informing each other, encouraging each other. And that's a really important thing. And energy invested in community is never wasted. No matter what the future holds, energy invested in community is never wasted. For whatever reason, YouTube seems to, my YouTube channel seems to attract a much higher proportion of, I'll be nice and call them naysayers. I'll leave it at that, than what Facebook does. Meh. I tell you what really touched me today. I had two different people come to me and said to me that they were there at the rally in Trafalgar where we had 70 people, that they were a part of that. And that really touched my heart because all of a sudden it reminded me that I was standing there looking at that crowd and thinking back to that first rally, the 70 people, and it was just overwhelming. The contrast is laughable, and it was just overwhelming. And having you two come up to me separately, two different people at two different times, and say, "Hey, I was there. I remember what you said, and I was a part of it, and I've been standing up ever since." Really touched me. And one lady was almost in tears, is a bit too strong, but really, really moved, as I was, to see what this movement had become. It just what a thrill. What a thrill to see what the movement has become in the 20 months of hard work since. That was really powerful for me. So thank you to both of you who came and talked to me. Actually, I got a message I want to share with you as well. I wasn't going to do this, but let me make sure my cigar is going to keep going for a minute. That should be good. Right. This is a message. So I have a number of friends who are on my side, for want of a better way to put it, but they can't speak out. They're in positions where they just can't, for a range of different reasons, each of them for very different reasons. And this is what someone sent to me actually last week, before today happened, before we knew what was going to happen today. We had no idea if it was going to be successful or not. And this is what they said to me. "Congratulations, mate. You never wilted, and it's finally starting to pay dividends for all of us. Still a long way to go, but I think the bill and ongoing restrictions have become political poison. Any crossbencher with a sniff of reality will know it's the end of their political career if they vote for the bill. It's no exaggeration to say that I owe my freedom to you and every other person who has been out there since March last year. When you're out there on Saturday," that was today, "you'll be out there for me and many others who still cannot be there. I can't tell you how much I admire and respect you." And I'm not going to say I, because it wasn't just me, when we started pushing back, we had no idea how this was going to go. We had no idea the direction that this was going to take. When the arrests started, September 2020, they started kicking down doors, dragging people away. We didn't know where that was going to go, what the end of that was going to be. When they rolled out the riot squad, started shooting people with rubber bullets, we didn't know how far that was going to go, what the end of that was going to be. But there have been, at all times, a core of, probably across all the different groups, probably 50, 60 people who have just kept organizing, kept making things happen, kept taking those risks. Most of them behind the scenes, right? You know my name, you know Monica's name, you know a number of other people's names, but trust me, for everyone whose name you know, there's another 10 whose names you will probably never hear. But they took the same risks. They faced the same consequences if they got caught or if the police tracked down who they were. And they've worked tirelessly for 20 months, taking all the same risks, not knowing what the outcome was going to be. And to see what's happened over the last month, watching last weekend, I wasn't able to make it. I still hadn't had clarification around my bail conditions and whether I even could. But to get to today, after all of that uncertainty, all of that fear, all of that knowing that we were putting it all on the line, and it's a big we, like this is not me, I'm talking 50, 60 people, that we were putting it all on the line. We were risking everything, and we did not know what was going to happen. But now we're starting to see what's going to happen. It's starting to unfold. We're starting to see the future in you, in all of you. This is a moment that I think is genuinely changing the complexion of this country. I'll say this state. This is a moment that is changing. No, this country. because of what we've endured here in Victoria, because of how extreme Daniel Andrews has been, even in comparison, as bad as Palaszczuk has been, as bad as Berejiklian was in many ways, and as disappointing as Peritet has been so far, Mark McGowan is his own brand of psychopath. As bad as they've been, Daniel Andrews was next level. And that has made us, I guess, the focus, the focal point. And when the rest of Australia sees what we're doing down here, in a very real sense, we become the tip of the spear, the leading edge of that knife that is going to cut down all of the fear and the lies and all of the nonsense that we've seen for 20 months. And I do think it's probably fair to say that we are changing the future of Australia. We are changing the complexion of politics in this country. What we need to be very mindful of is not only being focused on the immediate problem, right? Daniel Andrews is the immediate problem. This bill is the immediate problem. But he's not the only problem. And in a very real sense, we have to be humble enough to admit that we're the problem, because Daniel Andrews is the premier because we put him there twice, right? We all complain about two-party politics. Oh, it's a two-party system. Okay, but have we really actually, as a group, have any more than a small number of us ever really tried to do anything to change that? No. So we get the government we deserve. We get the premier we deserve. And this is where my hope really lies, is not just the fact that Daniel Andrews is going to get torn down, his legacy is going to get wiped away, his legislation is going to get repealed. Not just that, but that hundreds of thousands of Victorians and millions of people around Australia are becoming politically aware in a way that just was never possible before this happened. It was unimaginable. Before, we were almost proud of our apathy towards politics. She'll be right, mate. What can you do? You can't change it. They were the attitudes that we were almost proud of. Oh, you don't talk about politics in polite company. Talk about sport instead. Talk about something polite instead. And what we can't do is win this fight against Dan and then go back to not paying attention. We can never go back to not paying attention. It is every generation's responsibility to pass to the next generation the freedoms that they were given. We were given amazing freedoms, and we came very close to stuffing it up. We came very close to losing them. And just because we win this fight against Daniel Andrews, and trust me, we will, just because we win that fight doesn't mean that we can go back to not paying attention. The apathy that used to define us must be left in the dustbin of history. We have to become vigilant, active, watching, paying attention, always with our noses in their business, no matter how much they hate it. Because we've seen what happens when we trust them. We've seen what happens when we assume the best. Oh, they must have a reason for what they're doing. No, it's not good enough anymore. Oh, I trust them because they've got better information. No. Not good enough anymore. We need to be watching every single politician for the rest of our lives. Not one of them can be trusted. And I include me, if in some alternate universe, if I was crazy enough to ever run. Don't trust me either. Don't trust anyone. Verify. What was it, the Ronald Reagan quote of the Soviet Union? Trust but verify. Verify. Watch. Keep an eye on things. Make sure they're actually serving you. Be a pain in their ass. Because she'll be right, nearly cost us everything. Nearly cost our children everything. And we haven't won this yet. I believe we will. But even if we do, we can never go back to those attitudes. Yeah. Oops, it's scrolling so fast, I've lost it already. Yeah. We need to take more political responsibility for our future. Absolutely. Absolutely. We can no longer, what's the quote? I'm going to butcher the quote, but it goes along the lines of, the punishment for not paying attention to politics is to be ruled by lesser men than yourself. Something along that line, right? And going, oh, I don't really pay attention to that. Okay. then some hack, some inferior, mentally limited wannabe with a massive ego is going to end up in that position because decent people turned a blind eye. Doesn't mean you have to run, but just pay attention. Be engaged, be a part of it. Rachel, this is spot on. I've never followed politics or had any knowledge of politics in my 20 plus years of voting like I have in the last 2 years. This is exactly it. And I don't blame you, right? But we need to stay engaged. I'm a libertarian. I've been a libertarian for a bit over 10 years now. I come from a conservative background. And one of the things that I've often observed in politics is that everyone is a libertarian in at least one area. And this is relevant to the discussion. So let me go through this and then I'll bring it back to the discussion. So a libertarian, let me explain, simply believes that by default, the government should leave us alone unless there's a really compelling reason otherwise. And that compelling reason has to include that there are people hurting other people, right? The basis of law and the basis of government should be two very simple principles: don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. And if someone isn't hurting someone and they're not taking other people's stuff, then they should probably be left alone, right? That's essentially the libertarian position. And everyone's a libertarian in at least one area. If someone's in business, they might be a libertarian when it comes to taxes. If someone loves weed, they might be a libertarian when it comes to drug law reform. Everyone's got their one little pet peeve area where they feel like the government is just really pissing them off, right? The problem is most people don't think about it in an in principle way. They think about it on an issue by issue way. And so they go, well, on this issue, the government should leave that alone. On that issue, the government should do something. And they don't realize that that's actually completely logically inconsistent, that holding both of those at the same time is cognitive dissonance. So what the coronavirus has done, there's one more link in that chain before I bring it back to now. The final link in that chain is the process for people to actually become politically active usually is that one area where they're a libertarian, or that one area. Let me say it differently. It's when the government hurts them, either passes a rule that they don't like or won't pass legislation that they do want, that they suddenly go, I'm going to get politically active, and they get fired up on that one issue. And that's usually what it takes for people to become politically active. They have to get hurt by the government in some way. And then all of a sudden it matters. All of a sudden it's important. The opportunity that we have in this moment as a result of what Daniel Andrews has done to us here in Victoria is that he has hurt an enormous number of people. That's why we see an enormous number of people becoming politically active, becoming politically aware. We just saw 250,000 to 500,000 people show up at a park in the city, not for a rock concert, not for a motor race, not for any form of entertainment or celebrity. They showed up for politics. Yes, in the defense of freedom, but ultimately that was a political event. In Australia, where we are proud of our apathy towards politics, that would never have been possible were it not for the fact that so many people have been hurt by Daniel Andrews. So I'm not glad that people have been hurt by any stretch of the imagination. But the fact is people have been hurt. And so the question becomes, how do we use that in the most constructive possible way? We can't undo that hurt. Even if we set things right from now going forward, it doesn't magically undo the hurt that's been done. But how do we harness that in a constructive way that is going to actually make sure that this can never happen again? And that's exactly what I think is happening through these protests. That's exactly what's happening with the amount of awakening, the political awakening that is happening right now. But what's really important is that we don't just fight the issue, that we understand the principle. Because again, if you're just fighting the issue, oh, kill this bill. Okay, we won that issue. Daniel Andrews gets thrown out. We've got a different premier. Okay, great. I can go back to sleep. I'm going to go back to trusting my government because it's no longer about that issue. Well, you're going to end up in the same spot again because some other issue is going to come up and they'll use that to try and do the same thing. So what is really important is that we all wrap our minds around the principles. Political principles, principles of freedom, and really understand, okay, we're fighting for freedom. Great. Why? Why is freedom important? What is freedom? What does that even mean? When we talk about freedom, what do we actually mean by that? Define that for me. A British person would define that differently to how a German would define it compared to how an American would define it compared to how an Aussie would define, right? What are we fighting for? What is freedom? That's a subject for another time, but I want to see the thought, the question. Because freedom doesn't just mean kill the bill. Oh, great, now we're free. No, there's a lot more going on than just this bill. Yes, there's Great Reset and all that sort of stuff, sure. But even within Australia, within our political discourse, within people's attitudes towards each other, we're becoming less free. People are giving each other less rope, less grace. Excuse me. It manifests in many different forms. One of the more obvious ones is in cancel culture. That's only one of the many ones, but I cite it because it's such an obvious one. We're actually denying each other freedom in all kinds of small ways. And that's what creates the culture for the government to think that it can get away with denying us freedom in some really big ways. So while we're fighting this particular issue, and we need to be fighting this particular issue, that's a good thing. We need to be thinking about the principle behind it, so that when this issue is over and done and dusted, we can start to apply those principles to other areas of politics and other areas of life. And that is what is going to create ongoing, lasting, meaningful change, because that becomes a cultural shift, not just a political shift. Lots of good comments there. Lots of good comments. Thank you, guys. If you're watching, feel free to just be scrolling through the comments and seeing what people are saying. I'm just going to kind of enjoy my cigar and just keep trying to process what's happened today and keep thinking. So I'll get to some comments later on, but I won't make the mistake that I made the other day of trying to start at the start of the comments and work my way through, because I quickly realized the comments were actually coming in faster than I was looking at them. And then when I logged off that particular slow chat, I think, if I recall correctly, that one had over 2,000 comments. And I realized why it was that I wasn't catching up with the comments. So I'm not going to make that mistake. But towards the end, I will go through the current comments, whatever's coming up at that time. And I will bring up a bunch of them and we'll chat about a bunch of different things. But for now, I'm just going to keep on. Like I said at the start, I'm still processing. I'm still thinking this through. Today was massive. It was incredible. It was magical. It's kind of rocked my world a little bit. And it's still sinking in. Oh, hey. Let me do a bit of shameless self-promotion. Good people break bad laws. T-shirts. Actually, there we go. I actually got the hoodie here. Hoodies. Nice. Really well made. Triple stitched. Beautiful. Beautiful hoodies. Ladies cut T-shirts as well. And there's 6 different designs now. And I do have the link somewhere. Here it is. Let me just drop the link into the comments. So this is a way. A lot of people say, "Oh, how can we help you, etc." Well, this is the number one way that you can help, because we. It's a great defrag session. Yes, this is basically Gary Lee. This is basically what this is. It's a defrag session. I'm defragmenting my hard drive. Wow, kids these days, I have no idea what that means because it all happens automatically. I'm showing my age. But hey, did that link post? That scrolled through so quickly, I didn't actually see if that even posted. Sorry, I'm just going to post that link again. Studio.com product category /Topher field. There it is. Okay, it did drop in. So hey, if you want some, it helps me. All right, all the proceeds come to me. Help to pay for the team of people that I have. You would have seen that a lot of my slow chats now are being edited and cut up and re-uploaded in short segments. That includes all my interviews that I've done, the slow chats that I've done where I interview people, the slow chats like this one where I'm just unpacking my thoughts, as well as graphic design, all the new branding, but also that's ongoing. Every time I do a slow chat, I need a new little thing made up. And there's a lot of people working behind the scenes, and we're beginning to see some of the fruit of that now. They've been working with me now for getting, this is the 4th month now, but it's taken a little bit of lead time to get to the point where their work is starting to become visible. But my wife and I are paying for that out of our own pockets. And the t-shirts are basically, that's the main way of me trying to recoup some of that cost. So if that's something that interests you, then I would be very, very grateful if you would be willing to do that. Stu says, just use Linux, Topher. You'll never have to defragment a hard drive again. Cool. I'll take that on board. I'll change my operating system to Linux. Don't know about 10% of the whole country. I'd certainly say 5% of the whole country were at rallies today, which is huge. It's absolutely freaking massive. They say that for every person, and this is a pretty widely accepted sort of rule in political science, for every person that shows up to a protest, there's another 10 people that agree with that person but didn't show up because they couldn't, or because they didn't want to, or because they were afraid to, or whatever the reason might be. So if we had 250,000 people on the streets of Victoria today, on the streets of Melbourne today, that actually represents a minimum of 2.5 million people in Victoria who agree or are sympathetic with what we were saying, but couldn't be there, didn't want to be there, were afraid to be there, whatever the reason might be. Yeah, there's a lot of different numbers being reported, Juliette, sorry. I've seen estimates everywhere from 100,000 up to 500,000. 500,000 is only credible if you assume that it's everybody all through the city, because there are a lot of people that never made it to Flagstaff Gardens. And by the time the last people that did show up were coming in, some people had already left. Some people couldn't stay for the whole day. They had kids got bored, kids got whatever. So if you took absolutely everybody who was involved from the start of the day to the end of the day, anywhere in the city, you might be able to get to a number like that. I don't think you can get to 500,000 in the city, in the Flagstaff Gardens. I don't think the gardens have that capacity. I find 300,000 very credible, personally. That's, as I look at it, I've seen some drone footage. I'll be uploading some drone footage soon. I think 300,000 is a very defendable, very credible estimate of how many people were there. And that means, by typical political theory, that means there's about 3 million Victorians. In a state of about 6.5 million people, there's about 3 million Victorians that are at the very least sympathetic to what we were there to do and what we were talking about today. And that is a huge shift, from 70 people. I remember the first time we got multiple thousands. We got about 4,000 people at one of the rallies at the Shrine last year. And that was the first time we had big enough numbers that the police had to step back and they couldn't pounce on us. And that felt amazing, marching in that crowd. 4,000, that was my estimate. Some people said 10,000 plus. I disagree. My estimate was 4,000 people. Felt amazing. If only I'd known. If only I'd known then that we would get to this point now. Oh. Yeah. 50% of Victoria at least are second guessing all that has happened. Yeah. There's a lot of people that were wholeheartedly on board all this time. And they've shifted now to simply going, oh, look, maybe it went a bit too far. Maybe we shouldn't have done everything. Maybe we shouldn't have locked down quite that aggressively. Maybe some things could have been done better. But that's a huge win. That's a huge win. I use this crappy analogy because I don't have a better one. And apologies for those of you who've heard this before. If you've ever collected oysters, mussels, etc., You stick a bucket in the car, you drive to the beach, you get out of the car, you walk down to the sand, you go to where the rocks are or the pier or wherever you're going to get them from with the bucket. And the hardest thing that you have to do is pry them loose from where they're attached. And that can take a lot of work. You can snap a knife sometimes to, trying to pry them off a pier or pry them off the rocks. But once you've got them off, you can stick them in the bucket and take them home. And they can travel hundreds of kilometers with you very, very easily. But getting them to budge, that's the hard part. And right now, there are literally millions of Victorians that are budging. They're getting ripped off that position that they've held, that position of fear, of being a Danbot, if I can use that expression. The I stand with Danners, there's an enormous number of them that are getting cracked off that pier, and they're no longer willing to hold on to that position that they've held for the last 2 years. And that is absolutely massive. We haven't won the fight yet, but what has happened in the last month and what happened today are massive. Make no mistake. Do we think this is the peak? It depends. The fact is, if the bill gets killed off and nothing else gets put in its place, and the restrictions, not the disaster declaration, the state of emergency ends on the end of at midnight on the 15th of December, and from the 16th, there's no vaccination restrictions, there's no capacity limits, etc. Then a lot of people are going to become less active. And to be honest, that's not unfair, right? Showing up at a protest in the hundreds of thousands when there is a draconian bill in front of Parliament and it hangs in the balance makes a lot of sense. It's going to be very difficult and somewhat pointless. I wouldn't see the reason why we would try to get the same number of people to show up at a protest if there wasn't something specific. If it was just kind of a generic, we're generally not happy. Okay. That's where you do your other tactics, your letter writing campaigns, nominating yourself to run in politics, volunteering, becoming a paid member of a minor party and volunteering to help that minor party run their campaigns and advertise and get the word out. That's when that stuff makes a lot more sense. The rallies, the protests, they cost a lot, not financially for the organizers, although they do, many thousands of dollars. But for every person that puts aside an entire day and organizes that day and their kids and everything else around being there, the emotional energy, the time energy, it's an exhausting thing to do. And it's not sustainable in the long run. It's only sustainable for as long as there is a very specific goal. And that's what we have right now. And that's why the protests have gone the way they have in the last month. But once the bill is dead, and ideally we get to the end of the state of emergency and nothing has been put in place, the protests are going to die away. And I don't have a problem with that. When I say stay active, I'm not saying come out every Saturday. That's not what I'm saying. But that's when we do need to refocus our energies. Don't just let our energies dissipate. That's when we need to refocus our energies. And all I will say is get behind whichever of the freedom-loving minor parties you have the most respect for. In my case, that's the Liberal Democratic Party, not to be confused with the Liberal National Party. Forget them. They're almost as bad, all right, as the Labor Party. The Liberal Democratic Party, that's the party of Tim Quilty and David Limbrick, who have been absolutely fantastic. So it's one of the minor parties. They've got 2 on the crossbench, and they've been absolutely fantastic throughout this time. And that's where my energy is going to be going, right? And that's where my time investment, that's where I probably will become a paid member. I'm not a member of any political party, but you know what? Before this coming federal election, I'm probably going to go and sign up and become a paid member of the Liberal Democratic Party here in Victoria, to support them and to throw my voice behind them. But you know what? If United Australia Party and Reignite Democracy Australia, where they've kind of teamed up, if that's your jam, good, support them. If One Nation is your jam, good, support them. Any of these parties that have been good on the issue of lockdowns and segregation of society and the vaccine mandates, etc., find one of those minor parties, and whichever one you have the most respect for, back them. Channel that energy into them. You know what? You lived last year without AFL. You survived. I had a terrible time with a limited amount of Formula One for quite a long time. That's my sport. I have one sport that I'm passionate about is Formula One. And there was ages where there weren't any races before they finally started to build the calendar again. You know what? You can live without that stuff. So instead of getting back into that, like I always laugh when people are like, oh no, I don't have time for politics. But if you ask them about their fantasy football team, boy, they can give you all the stats and tell you why they're swapping this person for that person and da, right? You don't have time for politics, but you can invest an enormous amount of energy into a game. Now, games are good. They have a place in our lives. I've got no problem with that. But not at the expense of the stuff that actually matters. So even when this bill is dead, and even when Daniel Andrews is no longer the Premier of Victoria, and there's no longer a context in which protests make sense, let's not just switch off and go home. Let's throw our energy behind one of these minor parties that loves freedom, at least as far as it goes with the vaccine mandates, etc. I would quibble with the policies of things like One Nation, Great Australia Party, United Australia Party, etc. I would quibble with their policies that they're not actually very freedom-loving in other areas, but they have been good on these issues. That's why I personally like the Liberal Democrats, because I consider them to be the only party that is actually freedom-loving in every area. They come at it as a matter of principle. As a matter of principle, they are pro-freedom, and they apply that across every area. Whereas these other parties, they have areas where they're pro-freedom and areas where they're actually not. That's just my opinion. But I tell you what, throwing your weight behind any of these minor parties is going to be better than doing nothing. And it's going to be a hell of a lot better than giving your vote to whatever major party your dad used to vote for or whatever it is. Not bad. I had one of these a while ago and I didn't love it. This is a Gurkha Beauty given to me by someone who sent me a care package, a bunch of cigars to help me get through the making of the documentary. So thank you. If you're watching, you know who you are. And I didn't love the last one that I had. It was a while ago. This one's going all right. I don't mind this. Okay. Let me talk again about preferences. I just saw a question sort of scroll through and then disappear, saying how voting for a minor party is no good because your vote just ends up with a major party anyway. So let me try and break down what happens with preferential voting here in Australia. And I've gone through this before, but I made the mistake of not clarifying that what I've said previously was only about the upper house in Victoria. So let me be more specific and let me tell you about the lower house and let me tell you about the upper house and the way they vary. The lower house, which is more of a local area. The upper house, your vote goes into a larger area. So if, for example, in the federal election, your upper house vote is actually voting for a Victorian senator, right? They can get votes from anywhere in Victoria. Whereas your lower house member is going to be a much more local area to you. It's the same principle applies in the Victorian state election, but obviously on a smaller scale because it's a state election. So the lower house member has a seat that is the area immediately around you, and your upper house member is fighting for a seat that is a larger area, but still very much around you in your region of Victoria. The voting works slightly differently. In the lower house, my understanding is, and I will get complete clarity around this prior to the Victorian election and prior to the federal election, and I will be releasing detailed information about this. But let me discuss the principles with you. In the lower house, my understanding is you are obliged to number every single person on the ballot. So you will give your first vote, your number one will go to whomever, in my case, Liberal Democrats. Number two might go to One Nation. Number three might go to UAP, GAP, IMOP, whoever's got candidates, because different parties run different numbers of candidates. Not every party has a candidate in every single seat. So you number them all until you get down to the ones that you really don't want to be voting for, which in my case is going to be Labor, Greens, Liberals, Nationals, right? I don't really want to give my vote to any of them. So I will vote for everybody else first, and then I'll get to them. But I'm obliged by the system, and make sure you understand the rules for your particular state if you're out of Victoria, and also it differs between the federal and state elections. So I will be giving more detailed information about that. But also the instructions should be very clear. When you arrive at the voting booth, there should be very clear instructions for you. But I'm going to assume for the purposes of this that you have to number every single one. Otherwise, your vote is invalid. That is the way it is, I believe, across most of Australia in the lower house. So yes, you have to put a number behind these major parties that you don't want to vote for, right? And so it can feel like, well, my vote is just going to flow all the way down to them anyway. So what's the point? I might as well just vote for them in the first place. Well, hold your horses for a second. In order to get a lower house seat, they need a majority. 50% plus one. There might be 6 parties running, let's say. And yeah, the Liberal Party is going to get 35% of the primary vote. The Labor Party is going to get 40% of the primary vote, or 30% of the primary vote. The Greens will get 6%. Nationals usually try to deconflict with the Liberals, but anyway, that's another story. So they're all distributed, okay? No one's got 50% yet. But let's say you've got a couple of minor parties that are all freedom-loving minor parties. You've got IMOP, UAP, One Nation, Liberal Democrats. They're all sort of there, okay? What happens is they count up the primary votes. That's the number 1. So if you gave them a number 1, it goes to them, and they count up all of those first. And then they take whichever party has the fewest votes, and they say, right, you're out. You got the fewest primary votes out of everybody. Now we're going to distribute your preferences. So now they take those ballots that voted number 1 for whichever party got knocked out, and they look at who the number 2 is, and they shuffle them along to the number 2. So now all of a sudden, maybe let's say the minor party that was second last, maybe picks up all the preferences from the one that got knocked out, right? Everyone that voted for that one that got knocked out voted number 2 for another freedom-loving minor party. And that just happens to boost their numbers up so that they're no longer last, and they actually overtake the next one. And then whichever one is last after those preferences are distributed, they get eliminated. Their preferences get distributed. And so on it goes. And each time it's the bottom one gets knocked out, preferences are distributed. Bottom one gets knocked out, preferences are distributed. What can happen, and it's by no means guaranteed, but what can happen is that a party that didn't necessarily get a huge number of primary votes, or maybe was 3rd or 4th on the primary vote, can attract enough of these preferences to start to overtake some of the other parties. And it can happen, and we see this happen mostly in Europe, where minority governments are more of a norm than what they are over here. What can happen is that you can end up with a bit of an upset where the preferences just happen to fall in the right way, and someone who was an underdog, maybe expected to be 4th or 5th out of all the different candidates in that particular seat, can actually pick up enough preferences to start to overtake some of the others, and potentially to even take the seat. So yes, you can argue, because you have to put a number next to the major parties, that, my vote's going to end up flowing down to the major parties. Well, no, not necessarily. The key is to vote for all of the freedom-friendly minor parties. Put a number next to all of them before you put a number next to any of the major ones. And what that does is it makes sure that if in that seat one of them gets lucky and gets a good bunch of primary votes, even if it's not the one that you voted for, your preference ends up with them anyway. And because they're never last, they manage to stay out of that last position all the way through as they pick up more and more preferences. Then they keep on climbing on the back of preferences, and other parties begin to get knocked out. And that's how you can use preferences to try and improve the chances of freedom-friendly minor party candidates in the lower house. But the honest truth is the lower house is hard. For minor parties, the lower house is hard. We could run perfect campaigns across the entire state and would be lucky to pick up 1 or 2 lower house seats, right? It's hard. The Senate, or the upper house as it's called in Victoria, that's where the real game is. Now, the upper house can be a bit more intimidating because it covers a larger area, and because more parties target the upper house, because it is easier to get an upset. It's easier to get lucky in the upper house than it is in the lower house. It gets targeted by more parties. So this is the one that you can end up with this massive long piece of paper with like 30 different parties on it and all these different candidates. You're like, what the hell? And you can vote a couple of different ways on this ticket. And again, I'm generalizing. Different states are going to be a little bit different. Federal and Victorian state can be a little bit different. So check the rules for the specific election that you are voting in. And as I said, I will be releasing more specific information getting closer to the federal election and then again for the state election. But as a general rule, you've kind of got two ways of voting. You can vote above the line or you can vote below the line. Now, above the line, all you've got is one box for each party. Below the line, you have separate boxes for every candidate. So the Liberal Party might have 7 Senate candidates, right? And you can actually pick and choose which one you want to give your first vote to. Not that you should for the Liberal Party, but just as an example. So above the line, 1 box per party. Below the line, 1 box per candidate, which can be a lot more than the number of parties. You can vote above or below the line. I don't really mind. Just make sure you follow the rules. Voting below the line, I think the rules might have changed, but the last time I did that, which was a few elections ago, you were actually obliged to number every single box below the line, if my memory serves me correctly, I think. So just make sure you know the rules in your particular case. But as I understand it, in the upper house in Victoria, you are obliged to number at least 6 if you vote above the line. So again, you put a number 1 for the party that you value the most, that you respect the most. Then you look around and you put a number 2 on the party that you're okay with as a backup plan. Number 3 on the next one, number 4 on the next one, number 5, number 6. Make sure you meet that minimum number, that minimum requirement. Otherwise, the vote will be invalidated. With the upper house, and again, check the rules, but with the upper house, generally, you're not obliged to vote for every single party if you're voting above the line. You don't have to include any of the majors if you don't want to. Is there an argument that says you should? Well, maybe. Maybe you should just put the Liberal Party as your last preference, just in case none of the other ones get close, and then it ends up with them, and at least you're not helping Labor to win. You can make those judgment calls for yourself. But my understanding is you're not obliged to number every single box, and therefore you're not obliged to give your vote ultimately to any of the major parties. So let me explain how this can be so powerful in the upper house. In the lower house, they're ultimately trying to find one winner. And that means that one person has to have 50% plus 1. Otherwise, they're not elected. In the upper house, and I'll talk Senate for a second because I know the Senate, which is federal, better than I know the Victorian upper house. So let me talk Senate for a second. There are 6 senators elected from each state. So Emma has made a comment here. I don't believe that to be true anymore, and I need to have a chat with Emily from Voice of Victoria because she's across this stuff better than I am. If you vote above the line, you can select your first preference and then let your preferences flow as per the party preferences. I'm not sure that party preferences work that way in Victoria anymore. But each state's going to be different. Federal's going to be different from state. So there's some clarification needed around that. That's the way it used to be, party preferences. But I'm not sure that really happens anymore. They hand out how to vote cards that encourage you to vote in a certain way. But I don't believe I think that got reformed a couple of years ago. But I will try and get clarification on that between now and the election. So 6 senators get elected from Victoria, 6 from New South Wales, 6 from Queensland, etc., to go into the federal Senate. Now, what that means is instead of needing 50% plus 1 in order to be elected, you only need 1/6, sort of 14% of the vote. And now you're a senator. You can see immediately how much more achievable that is for a minor party candidate than having to get 50%. But here's where it gets really interesting. The first 5 of the 6 Senate spots, and I'm talking federally, get handed out to anyone that's got 14%. So the Liberal Party get 30%. Well, okay, 2 times 14 is 28. So they get 2 Senate seats automatically. Labor Party might get 2 Senate seats automatically. Maybe the Greens, maybe the Nationals might get a 5th Senate seat, all automatically because their primary vote was big enough. They got that 14%. But now there's 1 spot left. And that's not going to be won with 14% of the vote. That'll get won with about 8% of the vote, sometimes even a little bit less. And that's because ultimately, when you cut up the pie and you've already awarded all the other 5 Senate seats, you're left with only a small portion of the votes left, and whoever has the majority of that remaining slice of the pie gets the prize. So it's not even 14%, it's kind of half of 14%. And typically they consider around about 8% to be the safe margin. If you can get to 8%, you've got a Senate seat. You've got that last Senate seat from your state. And that's the one that's up for grabs in any given jurisdiction. So federally, each state, the last Senate seat is kind of the one that's up for grabs for the minor parties. At a state level, each of the upper house districts, the last of the seats awarded is kind of up for grabs for the minor parties. And that's what forms the crossbench in the upper house. If you've ever wondered why we have a big crossbench in the upper house and not so much in the lower house, it's because it's so much easier for minor parties to get someone elected into the upper house than it is the lower house. Yeah. You want to come say hi? Or? Oh. My wife has just stepped in. Oh, lovely. I'll have that later. That's not going to play nicely with us at all. Oh, okay. Just in the kitchen, thank you. Thank you. So my parents looked after the kids today and left a present, left some dessert, which is lovely. But it's not going to go well with a cigar, so I'm not going to have it right now. So this is where it can get really interesting. And this is where preferences become really, really vitally important when you are trying to win one of these final upper house or Senate seats, depending on whether you're talking state or federal. So think about preferences that I described before, because the method is the same. The last one gets eliminated, their preferences get distributed. The last one gets eliminated, their preferences get distributed. Think about that in the context of only having to get to 8%, not 50%. And think about how much more powerful that becomes. Now, if we did indeed have 450,000 people on the streets of Melbourne today, well, that's more than 7% of the Victorian population, 10% of the Melbourne population, but we had people come down from all over the state. Imagine if everyone that showed up did what I'm talking about and made sure that we put every single freedom-friendly minor party before we put any of the major parties, so that those preferences, it doesn't matter which one comes last and gets eliminated, those preferences will flow to the others. And then whichever one's last gets eliminated, their preferences flow to the next and to the next. And that gives us a really genuine fighting chance to overtake, whether it's the Greens, the Nationals, whoever it might be that might be competing with us for that last spot. We can overtake them by making sure that our preferences, every one of our votes, doesn't just count for one of the minor parties, but actually counts for every single one of the minor parties. Vote for your favorite one first, then vote for the next one, vote for the next one, vote for the next one. Vote until you're holding your nose and you're like, oh, I really don't want them to get it, but okay, they're less bad than the major parties. And keep on doing that until you eventually reach the point where there's just no one left. And then vote major parties if you feel you need to. By doing it that way, we can create a genuine opportunity for minor parties to pick up that last upper house seat in every district in Victoria. Now, this is essentially the way that the Greens have been able to control Parliament for the last 20, 25 odd years. What they did was they had a strategy that allowed them to pick up that last Senate seat quite consistently. Not every single time, but quite consistently, they were picking up those last Senate seats. They weren't in any state really getting enough votes to pick up to get 14% and pick up a Senate seat in their own right, but they were able to fight for and secure that final Senate seat. What that means is that quite often they're holding the balance of power in the Senate. I'm talking federally here. They're holding the balance of power. So neither the Labor Party nor the Liberal National parties combined actually have a majority. And if you want to get legislation through, you have to get the Greens to support it. And that gives them a tremendous amount of power. And that's why we've seen politics continuously heading in their direction for the last number of decades, because whether we have a Liberal Prime Minister or a Labor Prime Minister, they're continuously having to negotiate with the Greens in the Senate to get any legislation passed. Deals have to be done. The Greens are able to the tail is able to wag the dog, if that makes sense. Well, we can do the same thing. That strategy can work for us too. What if in every state that last Senate position actually went to, in one state it might be Liberal Democrats, another state it'll be UAP, another state it'll be One Nation. Actually, One Nation will probably pick up a few senators. What if that became the crossbench and the Greens no longer held that balance of power? What influence would that have on politics going forward now that all of a sudden, whoever the Prime Minister is, Labor or Liberal, they have to negotiate with some freedom-friendly minor parties in order to get legislation through the Senate? Think about the effect that that could have. It would be absolutely as profound as the effect that the Greens have had over the last 25, 30 years. Only it would be in the opposite direction, which in my opinion is a much better direction. So that's the bigger picture here. We're fighting a specific issue. We're fighting to kill the bill, and so we should. We're fighting to try and put an end to Daniel Andrews' political career, and so we should. But once that fight has been won, we need to direct our energies into the minor parties with the specific purpose of getting them to, between them, it may not be one that holds the balance of power, but between them to pick up those last upper house seats in the Victorian state election and those last Senate seats in the federal election and have them sit as the crossbench. Look at what's happening in Victoria right now. Daniel Andrews has to negotiate with the crossbench to get his bill through. We are potentially going to get saved by the crossbench refusing to roll over for him. Potentially. We're yet to see how that plays out. But we've had these three that have consistently just been the government's lapdogs: Animal Justice Party, the Greens, and the so-called Reason Party. What if they hadn't been there? What if we'd had a crossbench entirely populated by people who love freedom? Well, the extensions to the states of emergency might never have happened in the first place. The gang of three that has just rolled over for Daniel Andrews and given him everything that he's wanted up until this point, and is still trying to give him what he wants now, that might never have happened. It was the crossbench that was the problem, and the fact that the crossbench contained too many people who do not value freedom. They're there for other reasons. That's the strategy here. That's the play. And that is why it is so important for all of us to stay engaged, even after this issue is won. We win this issue, but we recognize the principle. We're not fighting to stop the bill. We're not fighting to throw out a bad politician. We are fighting to restore basic human rights and freedom in this country. We are fighting to get back what we were given by our ancestors through their blood, sweat, and tears. That's what we're fighting for. The principles of freedom are a topic for another time. We'll get there, but that's a topic for another time. But we need to make sure that we don't be satisfied with winning this issue. We need to go on to support the minor parties to start to change the entire culture and change the entire political landscape. It is very practical. It is very doable. And thanks to Daniel Andrews shaking hundreds of thousands, if not a couple of million Victorians out of their apathy, we have a window of opportunity where this is actually possible. We can actually do this because we just saw 250,000+ people show up in a park. When has that ever happened before for a political cause? It's huge. It's changing the face of our politics. And if we play our cards right, we can carry that forward and completely change the future of this country. Okay. I think that's everything that I needed to unpack. So I'm going to start bringing up some comments. They are scrolling very quickly, so I'm sorry. I'm going to miss 19 out of every 20, if not more. I do apologize, but I'll do my best. Let me try and catch Harriet's comment there. Where is my full speech to share? So the only one that's online at the moment was one that was actually recorded by my beautiful wife, who stuck her head in a moment ago, and was live streamed at the time. So you'll find that on my Facebook page. If you just scroll down a little bit, 1 or 2 posts ago, you'll find that. That's the only version that there is right now. My team are working on the actual this digital cinema cameras that we had there, and we're going to be uploading a higher quality version of that speech once that's done, but that's probably going to be the middle of the week sometime before that goes up. So for now, it's just the live stream. Estimates range from 100,000 to 500,000. I think anything less than 300,000 is not credible. I think there were at least 300,000 there. And potentially a lot more if you then factor in all the people that were still making their way through the city, etc. 450,000, I think, was Sky News' estimate. I don't think there were that many in the park, but again, if you include the people going through the city, yeah, quite possibly. So Julie, I assume this is referring to my speech. Go to Rookshawn's video at 59 minutes is where the speech is, and she's provided the link there so you can find that. Did I interact with the police today? No, I didn't have to. They didn't get in my face. They didn't try and block the march. It was really lovely. It was really nice, actually. Yes. And I don't think I will ever go back to not having a plan B. In the same way as the people that survived the Great Depression continued to stockpile food and, save scraps of clothing and blah, blah, blah for the rest of their days because of the lessons that they learned from the Great Depression. I think this experience has left its mark on me in some really deep ways that will probably change how I live forever. And it has really awakened me. Not that I should have needed it. I'd seen enough already, but I just didn't think it would happen so fast in Australia. But it has very much awakened me to how vulnerable we are to sovereign risk, to the risk of our own country going downhill. So yes, Plan B is very much still in place. We have a couple of different options that we have in place. I get a lot of requests for talking about Plan B, and I do keep meaning to spend more time on that. But right now I'm focused on the documentary, and then after that I'm probably going to be focused on the federal election. And then maybe I can get to spending a bit more time talking about Plan B. But there are so many options around the world. The only thing I'll say is this: don't think of it as taking everything out of this country and putting everything into another country. All you've done is shift your risk from one place to a different place that could just as easily go just as pear-shaped. If you're going to implement a Plan B, be thinking about distributing your risk. Live in a country maybe where you don't have their passport. You're there on a residence permit. You have a passport from one country, you live in a different country, your business might be registered in another country, depending on how you earn your money and what you do. And your bank accounts might be held in a different jurisdiction entirely again. It's more complicated. It requires more paperwork. You need professional advice from accountants and so forth to get it all set up and legal and done properly. But what that means is that if a country goes pear-shaped, you're no longer having to pick up your entire life and move it. You've already got a distributed risk. And that's what my Plan B is focused on. But that's a deep subject that I just don't want to go too deeply into. But I think it would be naive to not have a Plan B. So David Caff has obviously been following the Nomad Capitalist, who I highly recommend. Andrew Henderson is his name, the nomadcapitalist.com. I don't think it's got the I think it's just nomadcapitalist.com. He talks about 5 flags theory. And that's, if you want to dive into that stuff, start diving into Andrew Henderson's videos. I was tossing up moving to Florida. Tempting, and Florida is nice, but as I've said many times before, if Texas or Florida or any of those places were to secede from the United States, I would happily move there. For as long as they're under this absolutely monstrous federal government that just seems to think it can do whatever it wants. The American federal government is as scary as Daniel Andrews or worse. Their states are better, or can be better if you move to the right state. And they have, I think, a much more deeply embedded concept of freedom. And we mock them for that. We like to take the piss out of them for that. But in moments like this, you can start to say, well, actually, maybe there's some value to that. But I wouldn't really love moving to the US, not long term anyway, for as long as their federal government is as incredibly out of control as what it is right now. And this is one of the problems. A year ago I was considering Canada, but not now. If you move all your eggs into another basket, you're vulnerable to that basket being dropped, right? this is where you need to be looking at actually diversifying that risk. When moving forward, do the rallies continue until Dan is out? That's far off if he allows an election to go ahead. Outside of emergency powers being invoked, he can't stop an election from going ahead, right? That would create a constitutional crisis and draw an awful lot of attention to himself. And ultimately, the governor or the Queen would have to step in if he just chose to try and disregard the Constitution. The Constitution. So an election is going to go ahead. And if there are no emergency powers in place, then he can't really fiddle with it too much in terms of restricting who can vote, etc. Yes, things can happen in the counting process, etc. Our system is better at dealing with attempts at fraud and so forth than what the American system is. Is it perfect? Almost certainly not. Is it pretty good? Yes, I think it is. But will we have to keep protesting all the way until that election? No. We just need to be ready to fire up at a moment's notice if he tries to bring emergency powers back in, because that's where the danger is. It's the emergency powers that allow him to play a lot of games that we don't want him to have the power to play. So, no, we don't have to be. Protesting all the way through. We just have to be ready to fire up the minute he tries to go down that path again. Yeah, fair question, Chris. Could you talk about why you use the word tribe today? It feels like hacking emotionally fueled mob mentality. Not disagreeing, just curious. Yeah, I debated that word for quite some time. I worked on that speech for nearly a week, and actually then ended up editing it massively while I was off on the side. It's just this funny thing. You work on it, and then you actually get there, and there's something about the atmosphere that just brings this renewed clarity that you didn't have before. But the word tribe was in there from it was in the copy that I brought with me. So it was part of the script that I wrote. And I didn't want to use the word family because I think that is an emotionally manipulative word to use in that context. The people around you, they're not your family. Your family are your family. And I guess it's a little bit of a wordsmithing thing. I was talking about the fact that Daniel Andrews had taken our friends, had divided our families. And I didn't want to then turn around and say, behold your new friends, behold your new family. That's an unsatisfying, just from kind of a wanky literary perspective, it's an unsatisfying way to conclude that sentence. You need to give it a label that's different. And I debated a number of, community, multisyllabic, doesn't roll off the tongue particularly well, doesn't have a lot of emotional power. And yes, of course, I'm going to try and find words that are emotionally charged, that have emotional power. And I settled on the word tribe. Rightly or wrongly, that's something that people can debate, but I settled on the word tribe because I felt that yes, absolutely, it carries a lot of emotion. It can be associated with mob mentality. I can see your point there. But I also think that a tribe is not automatically a negative thing. A tribe is actually can be a really beautiful thing, a really great thing. And so that was the word that I settled on to try and give that particular moment the emotional punch that I believed that it should have. So there you go. And lots of people saying good choice. Tribe is right. Tribe works, etc. Thank you. How do you rationalize the support for Dan? Is Victoria a closet socialist state? Victoria is very close to being the California of Australia. And let me explain that. California is effectively a one-party state. They have a Republican Party, they have an opposition party, but they're never getting elected. And Victoria was very close to that point. I mean, since Jeff Kennett, we've only had one win by the Liberal Party in Victoria in 2 decades. And that was by the narrowest of margins, and they immediately lost government again at the next election. We are very close to being a one-party state. And there's this really interesting thing that happens. Once a political party is so cocky and confident of winning power, it stops thinking about fighting for the middle ground voters. So at a federal level, they're always fighting over the middle voters, right? Now, I would argue that we've still gone a long way sort of towards the socialist end of the political spectrum in the last number of decades anyway, but they're constantly concerning themselves with the swinging voters, the middle ground voters. But once a party is no longer afraid of the opposition winning, the psychology changes dramatically. And what happens is it starts to become all about the factional battles within the party. It starts to become all about, how do I climb my way to the top of this party? Because I don't actually have to care about the election. If I can just get to the top of the party, I'm going to win. I'm going to become the premier. And what that does is it actually means that they end up continuing to become more extreme, because they're trying to shore up all the different factions. And the more moderate factions, for whatever reason, tend to be the less, searching for the right word, less powerful isn't the right term. They can often be quite significant in terms of their numbers and their support base, but they're less vocal, they're less active, they're less manipulative. They don't do the same sorts of deals that the more extreme factions will do. And so someone like Daniel Andrews comes along, where he's very good at emotional manipulation and manipulating people and controlling people. And he discovers that he can start to get in and control a number of these more extreme factions, but that means that his policies have to make them happy and keep them happy. And once you transition into this kind of one-party state territory, inevitably your politics moves more extreme very, very quickly. And that's exactly what we've seen. And that's what's led us here. That's why Daniel Andrews is sitting there thinking he's God's gift, while he's trying to ram through some of the most extreme policies seen in a democratic country since ever. So the support for Dan. Are we a closet socialist state? We are the California of Australia. I'll start there. The only thing I'd dispute in your comment is the word closet. I don't think we're a closet socialist state. I think we're a fairly openly socialist state. People think that socialism means communism, and it doesn't. It's a distinct political ideology, it's distinct political philosophy, and we are a very socialist state. But what we're seeing is the fruit of this one-party state dynamic, where we're becoming more authoritarian within that socialism. Socialism isn't automatically authoritarian. It tends that way. One tends to lead to the other, but it isn't automatic. And what we're seeing is a massive rise in authoritarianism. Socialism, I think, is very much entrenched, not just in Victoria, but in Australian political psyche, very, very deeply entrenched. Middle-class welfare, very, very deeply entrenched. A lot of that came from our supposedly conservative Prime Minister, John Howard. He massively expanded middle-class welfare and therefore socialism. So, yes, I think we are a socialist state. We're a socialist country. We haven't been a particularly authoritarian socialist country, and that's allowed us to point to places like Venezuela or North Korea or wherever else and say, aha, we're not like them at all. Well, that's true. We're not like them, but it's very easy to get from where we are to where they are. And we've seen that in Victoria. We've seen just how quickly that can happen, potentially. So, yeah, we are a socialist state. We're not closet at all, in my opinion. Oops. What do I make of news polls suggesting that Dan is as popular as ever? There's a really interesting thing with polls. They are a victim of self-selection bias. Self-selection bias is where people decide whether or not they want to answer your question. The phone rings. Who's going to answer the phone and keep on talking once they find out that it's a pollster? It's a certain kind of person. It's a certain kind of psyche. It's someone who isn't immediately busy doing other things. They're probably not self-employed, by and large, because self-employed people have better things to do than sit on the phone with a pollster. They may not even have a job. So disproportionately, the people answering these questions are probably going to be unemployed. Not by no means all, but as if you took a representative sample of society and then you looked at who's actually talking to pollsters, it's going to skew towards the unemployed. It's going to skew towards people who are employed with normal jobs where they clock off and they go home and then they don't have work on their mind. Self-employed people, business people, they never really switch off from work, and they've never really got time in their life for a pollster. It rings them at 6 o'clock at night, whatever. Sure, they're not at work, but they're still working. So the self-selection bias becomes a real problem with all polls. But there's another layer that goes on when you have someone like Daniel Andrews, And when you have such an aggressive media campaign demonizing certain points of view and demonizing certain people. And I'll give you this example from when I was in the US in 2016 in the lead up to the Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump election. We went through 5 different states on literally sort of 5 different points of the US. And we were the Aussies, right? And so everyone loves Aussies over there. And we talked to heaps of different people. We would talk to waiters. We would talk, at our tables, we would talk to strangers in the street that we asked directions from because they'd hear the accent and be like, oh, where are you from? And we get talking. And it almost became a game for us where we would steer the conversation around towards politics in the upcoming election. And there was something really interesting. If someone was a Hillary Clinton voter or they intended to vote for Hillary Clinton, they would lead with that, right? Sometimes we wouldn't have even brought up politics, and they would lead with the fact that, yeah, I'm going to be voting for Hillary Clinton and da-da-da-da-da, right? They were proud of it. They were out. We would have other conversations with people, and they would get to know us, and they'd get comfortable with us. And there was almost this sense of checking over their shoulders to make sure the wrong person wasn't going to hear them. And then they would tell us, I'm actually going to be voting for Donald Trump. And what was amazing wasn't the number of people that said one way or the other, but the way that they said one way or the other. And what I realized then was that the polls were wildly inaccurate. Because if you get a phone call from a polling company that says, we would like to know how you plan to vote, if you're a Hillary Clinton voter, you're going to tell them because you're proud of being a Hillary Clinton voter. If you intended to vote for Donald Trump, you were probably going to choose to hang up the phone, right? Because that psychological kind of, you've been vilified, you've been told that you're evil, you're racist, blah, blah, blah. You've been called all these same names that we're getting called at the moment, right? And so they would choose not to answer the question. And so the polls were overwhelmingly in favor of Hillary Clinton. They did tighten as the election got very close. But for a long time, the polls were overwhelmingly in favor of Hillary Clinton. All the pundits were in favor of Hillary Clinton. All the media outlets, even in Australia, they were all in favor of Hillary Clinton. And I said before the election that I thought Trump was going to win in the 2016 election. And he did. In the end, actually, he won by a smaller margin than what I actually kind of suspected that he would. Fast forward to 2020, I also predicted that Trump would win, and he didn't. But being on the ground in 2016 and hearing the way that people answered that question or the way that people admitted who they were going to vote for made me realize just how flawed polling can be because of self-selection bias. People choose whether or not they're going to answer the question. There is an enormous amount of self-selection risk in any polls being done in Victoria right now. Because anyone that isn't happy with Daniel Andrews is being told by the mainstream media that they're crazy, that they're a conspiracy theorist, that they're on the same side as anti-vaxxers and lizard people believers and the moon landing was fake believers. And, they're being lumped into that same category. So do they want to answer the question to some random person on the other end of the phone? No, they don't want to answer the question. So they don't. And we end up with what I think are polls that are very heavily over-representing Daniel Andrews' popularity right now. That's my opinion. All right, there must be some big conversations going on in the comments because there's a lot of comments that are coming up that I'm just like, that without context, I've got no idea what's going on there. So you guys must be talking to each other, which is great. Okay, so a map checking app has estimated the Melbourne crowd at 423,279. Yeah, the garbage in, garbage out. Like any computer model, it all comes down to how rigorous the person entering the data is. I'd need to have a look at it and see what they've done to know whether I would agree with that number or not. I don't think we had that many in the park. I just don't think we had that many in the park at any one point in time. Yep, lots of conversations going on. So Harriet, a t-shirt with "I am the captain now." You read my mind. I've actually got 3 new designs that my designer will be working on Monday and Tuesday, and I hope to have those available by sort of the middle of next week. And one of them is, "Hey Dan, we are the captain now." So that will be available sometime soon. Whoops. I'm trying to chase a message. There we go. If there was 300,000, that sends a huge message. Exactly. From our point of view, anything above 100,000, a genuine 100,000, is a massive win, and we smashed that out of the park. So above that is we're really just sort of putting an exclamation mark on the point, but the point is already made. At 100,000 people, the point is already made. So yes, we can argue about how big it was. The fact is, it was big enough, right? It was huge. It was plenty big enough. This isn't an area that I've researched in Victoria specifically, Meta Chad. Interesting name. So I'm not going to try and talk intelligently about what's happening in Victoria specifically, but I can talk about what's happening in the use of behavioural insight departments more generally, in a broader sense. What's happening now is governments are spending our money, taxpayers' dollars, to manipulate us. There's no other way to say it. And this is something that we recognize from the Soviet Union with the various Russian government newspapers that were there, and the way that they controlled information, the way that they tried to manipulate people, control behavior. We've essentially normalized that now in Western countries. The UK are doing it. We're certainly doing it here in Australia and Victoria, where governments are so brazen that they take our money and then they spend it on psychologists and marketing teams to try and figure out how to manipulate us and control us and get us to do the right thing, get us to do the good thing. Oh, do I go down that rabbit hole or not? Okay, do you want a rabbit hole? Answer in the comments. Do you want a rabbit hole? It's probably a solid 10-minute rabbit hole. But essentially, they are using, so this is the non-rabbit hole version. They're essentially using our money to then make us do what they think is right, which is a complete inversion of the relationship that's supposed to be there. They're supposed to serve us. They're supposed to do what we think is right. And they're now, okay, right, I've got a wall of yes, please, rabbit hole, please. Okay, all right, rabbit hole it is. This idea of doing what's right, okay? The people involved in these behavioral insights departments, these manipulation departments and projects, they think they're doing the right thing because they're trying to figure out how we can increase compliance with these good rules that keep people safe and blah, blah, blah. We're just trying to get people to do the right thing. Sorry, just need to get this going again because I can see it's still lit right in the middle, but it's not burning right to the outside the way that it should. So give me 1 second. Come on. Okay, no, I'm just going to put it down. I will relight that later. Okay, rabbit hole time. The idea, the concept of doing the right thing. This comes back to what I was talking about earlier, principle versus issue. Doing the right thing. I'll tie it all together later, but just for the moment, understand this is in the context of standing up for a principle or dealing with each thing on an issue by issue basis. So, we have a government that says, we're just trying to get everyone to do the right thing. Another way of expressing that is the greater good, right? We're focused on the greater good. And anyone that's seen the movie Hot Fuzz, which I did post a clip of, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, The Greater Good. That's a brilliant movie, hilarious movie, and really does bring into fairly sharp focus the fact that the concept of the greater good, the concept of we just want people to do the right thing for everybody else, is very subject to abuse, very, very vulnerable to being manipulated by people who may not have the best of intentions. And here's how it works. You turn around and the government says, we need to have policies that do the most good for the most number of people, right? As a government, we have to try and do the right thing for as many people as possible. And so we've got this law, and some people are going to be really unhappy about it because of the way that it's going to affect them in a negative way. But the majority of people are going to be affected in a positive way. And so overall, we think that this is the greater good overall, that this is from a utilitarian point of view. And this is an important concept and an important word, utilitarian. The utility of a given policy. Does it help more people than it hurts? Does it help them in a greater way than it hurts the people that it hurts? If so, we can say that this has utility, right? That from a utilitarian perspective, this is a good policy because it does more good than harm. The problem with that is you could very easily make an argument for things like confiscation of wealth. Oh, we've got some rich people. We're going to take most of their money, not all, but we're going to take most of their money and distribute it amongst everybody else. We've got a small number of pissed off people, but a very large number of happy people. So from a utilitarian perspective, from the greater good perspective, we've done the right thing. This is a good policy. And so we immediately see that the greater good argument, outside of the context of principles, if you don't bring it back to principles before you consider the utilitarian aspect of it, you can really go a long way wrong very, very quickly. Every dictator in history has believed that they were the good guy, and many of them have believed that they weren't just the good guy for themselves, but they were actually the good guy for their people. They were helping their people. And no doubt, there are some people who are much better off under a dictator because they end up, schmoozing the right people and being on the right side of the money flows, and they end up better off. The idea that the government gets to decide what is for all of our greater good is in itself a problem. In principle, that is not the government's job. It's our job to decide how our money gets spent, what we want to do with our spare time, how we choose to recreate, where we choose to live, the job that we choose to work. You look at communist countries, they'll tell you what job you're going to work, and you're going to do it, comrade, for the greater good, for the good of society, right? Well, no. In principle, that's wrong because they don't have the right, they don't have the authority to do that. And this is why it's so important to bring things back to principles rather than getting caught up in the issue by issue argument of, oh, is this going to be of the greatest utility? Is this going to be for the greater good? Well, hang on first, before we ask ourselves that question, ask ourselves the fundamental question. In principle, is this even allowable for a government to do this? Is this even acceptable for us to be having this conversation in a democratic country where the government serves the people? We have to have the principle argument first. And then once you've ensured that the various options you're looking at are all acceptable from a principle perspective, then you can apply the utilitarian lens. Like, yes, we have to be, we have, we want to fix this road or that road, which is going to cost less and do more good, right? That's a utilitarian argument. And that is a good way to use a utilitarian framework. But we first have to ask ourselves, should the government be owning and building roads in the first place? There's a principle argument that we need to have before we have the utilitarian argument about which way to do this. Behavioral insight departments and this kind of manipulation that's going on from governments around the world is them basically saying, we will make you do what we believe is for the greater good, no matter what you believe is for your good. They're specifically and deliberately trying to take choices away from you for the greater good. And I think in principle that is wrong. I don't care whether they can argue that they've achieved X, Y, Z outcomes that are better for society. In principle, it's wrong. And it is an inversion of the relationship between government and the governed. It is, and they serve us. We pay their wages. Every time they spend money, it's our money. They serve us. They are there to protect our rights. And these sorts of projects that they're doing now through behavioral insight departments, etc., is an attempt to flip that completely on its head so that we serve their vision and their idea of what a perfect society or a better society looks like. So I think that these are deeply disturbing and very, very dangerous. The fact that they exist, the fact that our politicians have the gall to actually spend our money in this way is a symptom of just how far wrong we've gone politically and how much work we have to do to bring it back. There you go. That's the rabbit hole. What else have we got? Okay, how do we maintain a balanced culture and economy without some level of compromise for greater good? Who gets to decide what's balanced? This is a problem that we come up with all the time, and I addressed it in a video that's about 9 years old now, The Forbidden History of Unpopular People. And it was talking about free speech and the fact that the federal government at the time, wanted to create a thing called the News Media Council, which would decide what was true and what was not. It was literally the Ministry of Truth from 1984. And the question that I posed in that video was, true according to whom? There are some things that are objectively true. There are many things that are not. There are many things that involve a certain amount of subjectivity. And so when we set up a government body that gets to decide what's true, the question is, true according to who, right? And when we have a government that is saying, oh, we're going to keep the country balanced, the question becomes, balanced according to who? Whose priorities, whose idea of balance are we now enslaving the entire country to? We're going to reshape the entire country to serve a singular individual's idea of balance. I think the much better way to do it is that each of us live our own lives in pursuit of our own balance. People love culture. People also love to have a thriving economy and businesses. It's really interesting to note that the cleanest countries in the world tend to be the wealthiest countries in the world. They tend to be able to have the money to have things like gardens around their houses that are properly maintained. National parks and state parks are a luxury that only relatively wealthy countries can afford. Proper waste disposal systems, waste management systems, where it doesn't just end up in the waterways and getting washed out to sea, that tends to be a luxury that only wealthier countries can afford. And there's an idea in a lot of ecological circles, a lot of environmental circles, that there's a zero-sum game played between the economy and the environment, or between the economy and culture. And the bigger the economy gets, the more business-focused we become, the more these other things are going to suffer. But history actually suggests the opposite. The more affluent we become and the more successful we become in business, the more resources we have to be able to spend on the things that make us happy. Having a nice environment around us, having cultural events to go to, having family events to go to. These are luxuries that subsistence farmers of 300-400 years ago didn't have, these luxuries that we have now. They didn't have the money, they didn't have the time. So I would argue that each of us gets to define what balance looks like for us. And the invisible hand, his name escapes me, an author, I'm sure someone already knows who he is, please throw it in the comments, an author who spoke about this idea of the invisible hand. And all of us making our own decisions, all of us living our best lives in our best way, has this amazing effect of creating this tapestry that is really beautiful. And if you look at where we are now, Adam Smith, thank you, Peter, Adam Smith, the invisible hand. If you look at where we are now compared to where we were 100 years ago, actually this was done, a study was done in the US, where they went to an enormous number of people, I think it was in the tens of thousands of people, and they sat down with them and they gave them an explanation of what John D. Rockefeller's life was like. Now, he was the richest man alive at one time. But they went through what his life was like. They didn't have aspirin. They didn't have antibiotics. They didn't have aeroplanes to get around. They talked about how he slept and where he slept and what his life was like. And then they asked people, would you like to swap with him? Would you like to go from being whatever you are now, wherever you sit in the socio-political spectrum now, would you like to swap to become the richest man 120 odd years ago? And the overwhelming answer was no. They wouldn't actually want to swap, because what they would be giving up, being the richest man back then, would suck compared to being an average person today. And that's as a consequence of all of us, of capitalism, really, which understood properly, not corporatism with big corporations getting into bed with governments, etc. That's a massive problem in its own right. Capitalism, there's simply the freedom to make your own choices in your life and to decide how you spend your money and what you spend it on and how you want to live. That has led to the greatest rise in prosperity over the last 250 years than we've ever seen in history. More people have been pulled out of poverty since the year 2000 than in all of the rest of history combined. It's astonishing what we've achieved as we've all been pursuing our own individual goals. And I think it would be very, very dangerous to hand over to a government this idea that they get to decide what balance looks like. Again, on principle, I don't think that's their role. Their role is to protect our rights, maybe have an army, and get the hell out of our way. That's their role. That's very nice. Anne, just finished a 12-hour shift. I'm grateful for work here in segregated Victoria. This live stream is my deep breath in the whole day. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Oops. Mant disagrees. The wealthiest countries tend to have the highest suicide rates. The minimal lifestyle tends to make people happy. Yes and no. You've got places like Bhutan that has this gross national happiness measure. And yes, they're very good at telling their people that they have to be happy. Suicide is a massive problem. It is. The rise of suicide has coincided quite closely with the rejection of the concept of God. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that rejecting the concept of God leaves a very, very big hole in your life. And it's also, we're certainly seeing spikes in it now in wealthy countries as they make people less wealthy. We've seen it in Victoria as a result of all the lockdowns, people being very, very badly hurt in that way. So I think that's a very simplistic way to look at that particular metric. So I've had a bunch of people asking me to talk about Albo. I don't believe I really brought up Albo at all at any point. So I'm not sure why everyone's asking me to talk about Albo, but maybe they're talking to somebody else in the comments. I'm not sure. But anyway, there you go. Yeah. So Cam, this is exactly right. If all mankind minus one were of one opinion and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. Absolutely, 100%. Peter, come on. I'm Team Ricardo. Really, dude, come on. Actually, Verstappen's grown up a lot since he came into the sport. We're talking Formula One for those that are lost. I really didn't like him when he came into the sport, but he's matured a lot, and I have to give him credit for that. And just to see it spice up the monotony of Hamilton winning every championship, I'm actually kind of hoping that Red Bull and Max Verstappen manage to get it this year, but we'll see. Yes, Django is with me, Team Ricardo. Yep, I agree. NASCAR for Rick. I do enjoy me a good crash, a good NASCAR crash. That can be good. Yeah, I tend to agree with this. I mean, it's a slightly cynical way to express it, but yes, I broadly speaking, I tend to agree. The happiest countries is just a stat created by the left to make us think that we should destroy our lives for simplicity. Listen, anyone in a rich country can simplify their lives anytime they want to. No one's making you live a consumer life. No one's making you have all that stuff, earn all that money, go on all those holidays, etc. If you're less happy because of it, just stop doing it. Right? No one's making you do it. But guess what? People in those poorer countries where they have to be happy or else, they don't have the option of going on a holiday, buying any more stuff or earning lots of money. They don't get that choice. So I would much rather be in a country where I have that choice, and I'll make the choice that makes me the happiest. Brandon is the best NASCAR driver. Look, when all that Let's Go Brandon stuff happened, I was completely thrown. I had no idea what was going on with that. But I caught up shortly afterwards, and it's quite funny. But that's a story for another time. For or against nuclear energy, very much for it. Nuclear energy is, and a lot of people's heads are going to explode, it is the safest form of energy production that mankind has ever devised, with the exception of nothing. It is safer than wind. It kills fewer people than wind. Wrap your head around that. Okay, this is a good question. I'll try not to rabbit hole on this one. What sort of government do we need? So I'm a libertarian. And within the sort of the small government spectrum, you've got anarchists who basically believe, or voluntarists, as they, I think, prefer to be called these days, because anarchy has this connotation of violence, which actually isn't inherent to the word at all. So voluntarists, where they would say that there shouldn't be any form of government, that every single interaction that we have should be voluntary. I agree in principle. Then we have what are called minarchists who say, look, that whole voluntarism thing, okay, but what about courts and prison systems? And what about a defense force? And what about some of this stuff? And they go, all right, no, there's some practical issues there. So we're going to be what are called minarchists, where we want a minimum amount of government, where they have a defense force, they run courts, they have police and detectives to investigate when there's been a murder and that sort of stuff, but nothing else. Then you have libertarians, who can really, libertarian is kind of a catch-all term that can cover quite a broad spectrum. I tend to avoid the debates about exactly how small our government should be, simply because it's not relevant at the moment. The government we have right now is an elephant, and arguing about whether our government should be an ant or a mouse isn't really relevant when your government is currently an elephant and getting bigger, right? So from my perspective, what I would like to see is a government where all of the laws fit into one chunky novel that someone with a year 10 education can read and understand in a couple of days. All right? It should be possible for each and every one of us to be able to know all of the laws that apply to us. It's not possible today. There are tens upon tens of thousands of pages of legislation. It is written in a very difficult to read manner that makes it very inaccessible for the average person. The irony being we are obliged to obey all of those rules, whether we know that they exist or not, and ignorance is no excuse. Well, that's pretty immoral if ignorance is no excuse, but it's not possible to be anything other than ignorant because there's just too much. That seems pretty immoral to me. So I'm not going to get too hung up on whether the government should be an ant or a mouse. Let's just start making it smaller and see where we end up. And it's sort of a cop-out, okay? It's a cop-out, but I don't see a lot of value in these really detailed discussions of what should the final result be, of what government we should have. Let's just change direction from getting bigger to getting smaller, and then we can have those conversations as they become more relevant further down the line. Does Australia have fission reactors? We have a facility near Sydney that does medicines and a few other things, a few experiments and so forth. We don't have anything, to my knowledge. I'm fairly confident saying we don't have anything that is generating electricity in Australia for mass use. Oops, that was a good question, and it scrolled past. Okay. Do I think that Shane Patton should step down to pave the way to rebuilding trust and healing? I would love to say yes, because I think he's completely betrayed the trust of the Victorian people and he has absolutely no right to be in the position that he's in. However, we have a problem, because I am assured by someone who is in a position to know that all of the other alternatives are even worse than Shane Patton. And if we kick him out and then just accept whoever is put forward as the replacement, they are going to be even worse as a spineless lapdog of the government of the day. So, as much as I absolutely think he needs to be made an example of, he's betrayed the Victorian people, but remember, he's also betrayed the Victorian police. He has done so much damage to their reputation, to the relationship with the public that they depend on to do their job. He's caused enormous amounts of harm to his own members, as well as to the Victorian public. And he should be made an example of for that. But from a practical perspective, yeah, is it out of the frying pan and into the fire? That's what I'm being assured by people that do know. That would actually be a really, Cam's jumped in. If Patton goes, Luke Cornelius is most likely to get the top job and he's worse. And Jacob Patton, better the devil you know. Maybe in this particular situation, maybe. Grebo, I would too. We don't get to vote on who the police commissioner is, but I think Crystal Mitchell would do a much better job. Yeah, Kel Glare, so former Victorian Police Commissioner, and he's been interviewed on Discernible. Kel Glare, former Victoria Police Commissioner, has been very vocal, speaking out against what Victoria Police have done during this time and the way they've allowed themselves to be politicised. Go to Matt Wong or Discernible, I think discernible.io if you're looking for the website, or just go to Facebook and search for Discernible. Search on their page for Kel Glare. Amazing interview between Matt Wong and Kel Glare. Why can't we remove the tyrants in power? I don't know where you are. Not a Democrat. If you're saying not a Democrat, I'm guessing that you're probably in the US. In Australia, we don't have a concept such as a recall election. That's just not a thing over here. In Victoria, our elections are scheduled a little bit like the US presidential elections. There's a known date, there's a specific cadence in which they happen. And it takes something pretty extraordinary to force an election to happen outside of that cadence. It's not something that we can just have a referendum or have a vote or do a straw poll and say, hey, we need to have an election. We can't recall premiers in that way. So there's certain things that we can do to try and get their own party to tear them down and to remove them as the leader of the party and that sort of thing. But in Victoria, unfortunately, there are not really constitutional mechanisms that we can use to throw him out outside of the election unless we can get his own party to tear him down. Good point from Benjamin Robson. The Liberal Democratic Party, again, not to be confused with the Liberal Nationals, the Liberal Democratic Party, the party of David Limbrick and Tim Quilty, two of the great freedom fighters that we do have in the upper house in the Victorian Parliament. They've recently released their Freedom Manifesto, which is what they're taking to the federal and the next Victorian state election. And it does include adding recall elections. That is the ability for enough of us, if there's enough of us that are really, really pissed off with the government, we can actually force a recall election so that we get to have our say and cast our judgment on them as the government in our time rather than waiting for the next election. Okay, I see some people are giving technical support to some others who apparently don't have sound. Hopefully that gets figured out. Yeah, so Craig Backman today talked about masculinity in a positive way as defenders of family. I found that refreshing as it often gets wrongly labeled as toxic. Your thoughts? Masculinity is, I think, a deeply misunderstood word. I consider myself to be quite masculine, despite the fact that I don't have big muscles or tattoos. I am perfectly happy to cry in public. I will hug my wife and show affection to my kids, play with them in the park and make an idiot out of myself. I think that's what being a man actually is. I think that's what masculinity actually is. The toxic masculinity thing in some ways is overblown, but underneath it, there is a real problem. We have a problem at the moment where fatherhood, manhood, courage, leadership, wanting to be a protector and a provider has kind of been demonized. And it's happened over decades, over a couple of generations. And so what we've done is we've told a lot of young men as they've been growing up that they're not allowed to be a man in that sense. And so we end up with a lot of men who are quite feminized, can end up being quite selfish. They're not willing to protect their families. They're not willing to provide for their families. They're much more interested in themselves, because once you take away that calling that I think most men do feel, once you take that away from them, they kind of go, well, then why am I here? Well, I must be living for myself, so I'm going to do that. But then you get the backlash, the counterculture to that. And this is where there is some legitimacy to the toxic masculinity thing, where some blokes rebel against that idea of masculinity, and they're right to do so, right? Because that effeminate idea of masculinity is equally wrong. But they react by going, I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to become a tough guy, and I'm going to push other people around and get my way and get my will, and everyone's going to be afraid of me and do what they're told. That's not masculinity either. That's usually actually masking cowardice and fear is usually what drives that. And we do have a challenge on our hands of actually getting men, young and old, to realize that masculinity is actually about being confident in who you are and why you are, being willing to stand for what you believe is right without having to be without having to I don't even really have a word for it. This isn't a topic I usually talk about. It's not machismo, right? Manhood and machismo are two very, very different things. I would say that the last 20 months of my life have been a very real test of my manhood. They've been a very real test of my masculinity. And in my personal opinion, and you're welcome to disagree, I think I've done pretty well in that test. I haven't had to beat my chest and start fights with people and blah blah blah. In fact, I'm incredibly non-violent. I'm incredibly non-confrontational, but I stand unflinchingly for what I believe. And I do what I do to protect my family, to protect my kids, so that they have a future in a free country rather than one that is in bondage. So I, I think we need more men to set that kind of example, to say this is what manhood is actually about. It's not about beating your chest and drawing attention to yourself and being some idea of a machismo or a James Bond, womanizing notches in the belt kind of concept. That's not what it is at all. Manhood is about actually being willing to serve others, being willing to protect others, being willing to do the hard yards and the hard work, even when other people may not be willing to do it alongside you. And I think the more people we can have setting that example, I mean, I would add Graham Hood as another man who is setting a wonderful example of what it is to be a man. Craig Backman, I've only met him very recently, but I tell you what, I like the guy. And yeah, he wears his heart on his sleeve. Anyone that saw the video, the behind the scenes excerpt from the Battleground Melbourne interviews, he wears his heart on his sleeve, and he is the real deal. People are like, oh, good acting. No. That was real. He feels this deep in his soul, and he wears his heart on his sleeve. But like me, he stands his ground. He's gotten himself onto the right side of history, and he's not going to compromise. And we need more of these sorts of examples of manhood, because young men are searching. They're searching for that example of manhood. And too many are being caught up into this machismo kind of idea, thinking that that's the right way to rebel against this effeminate idea of what it is to be a male. And I agree with rejecting that effeminate idea. I agree wholeheartedly with that. But going to this machismo idea is just so destructive to them, to their families, to their future wives and partners. And yeah, we need more men to be offering a better example. That's what I think. Thank you, Lily. I appreciate that. Yeah. Wearing your heart on your sleeve builds trust. When you can let your guard down and let people in, they trust you a lot more. Graham Hood is a great man. Yes, he is. I like him. I'm not going to argue. Not going to argue with that. Yeah, we do. We have some amazing men fighting this fight, and many more whose names you will never know. They're fighting in the shadows. They're the ones in the background. I've never organized a protest, right? I've never had to, because there are other people doing the heavy lifting on that. And you may never know their names, but they have been incredible. And it's a shame that for the most part, we will never know their names. But their work in the background, men and women, but their work in the background has made a massive difference. Thank you, Rick. Good night. All right. Yes, we've got a few people going to bed. What is it? Oh, goodness, 2.5 hours. Okay, yeah, I'm going to have to head to bed soon. Will I be doing an education series on Aussie politics? I am going to be talking a lot more about the elections and how elections work as they get closer. But also, I do want to do a series on sort of politics and freedom and the concepts of freedom. I talked a little bit about that earlier in the week when I did another slow chat, but that's a big project that's going to come up probably in 2022. It's certainly not going to happen this year. I'm not going to start this year. The people in the shadows, yeah. The problem with them being in the shadows, Liz, is that you probably never will meet them, but they have been amazing. Did I like your boy band comment a day or two ago? I missed it. Sorry, Michael. I didn't actually see it. Can I talk about ScoMo quickly? ScoMo's been a big effing disappointment. Big disappointment. And we need to make sure that federally, neither ScoMo nor Anthony Albanese win the next election. We need to make sure that there is a hung parliament in the lower house, because it's the lower house that forms government. We need to make sure that enough freedom-loving minor parties pick up lower house seats around Australia, that they hold the balance of power in the lower house, and make sure that whoever gets more votes out of the Labor Party or the Liberal Party, they have to negotiate with freedom-friendly crossbenchers in the middle of the lower house in order to form government. Because honestly, left to his own devices, the guy's been worse than useless. Alrighty, guys. Yeah, Melissa says I'm being too nice about ScoMo. Yeah, Too nice. Yeah, there's some amazing quiet achievers in this movement. There are some incredible quiet achievers. And sadly, they are probably never going to get the recognition they deserve. But man, they have made a world of difference. Only recently discovered, enjoyed listening. Nice to have you, Rachel. Thank you for joining. Cade says, same thing, first time tuning in, really enjoyed it. Thanks for spending time. Well, thank you for spending time with me. I really appreciate it. I'm going to call it a night, but I am going to take the opportunity one last time. Spruik the merch, help me to pay for the people, the amazing people that are helping me to do what I do and to do more of it. I've got hoodies, got ladies' t-shirts, got men's t-shirts. There's 6 different designs with more designs coming later this week. And make sure that you check out. Oh, actually, I think I've still got the link copied. So there we go. Yeah. Let me paste that again. A little bit of shameless self-promotion. If they're going to say that I'm a grifter and accuse me of just being in it for the money, I might as well try and sell stuff if they're going to accuse me of it anyway. So guys, have a great night. Today was amazing. Be encouraged. We are turning the tide. After 20 months of hard slog, we are turning the tide. We need to keep the pressure on, keep tightening those screws. I will keep watching what's going on, and I'll keep coming back with slow chats whenever I think it's needed to update you on what's going on and to talk about what we need to do next. In the meantime, get some sleep, love your families, build community. It's never a waste of effort to build community. So guys, Michael has just clarified after the picture of myself, Avi and Rookshawn. Yeah, yes, I did see. I'd forgotten about it. I did see that comment. All right, there's a very funny picture on my Facebook page and on my Instagram. You might have to go back a day or two. Avi, Rookshawn, and myself did the 3 wise monkeys, the hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil thing. Go and have a look at it. It's very funny. Yes, what's even funnier, Michael, is that we, at the same photo shoot, we did another picture, the 3 of us plus Monica Schmidt, and we ripped off a, what was the band? Oh goodness, I can't remember the name of the band. You have to scroll back a while and find it. We ripped off a cover photo of I don't know, a popular band. So we had a lot of fun on that photo shoot, as well as getting the serious photos that we needed. We had a lot of fun on that photo shoot as well. So guys, that's it from me. Get some sleep, love your families, build community, and I will talk to you again soon. Cheers.